Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So this evening we have our weekly monk chat session, your opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism, and we'll do the best we can to give some kind of reply. So my name is Bhante Sudaso, and I'm here with Ajahn Wade. And we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll start going through questions. So if you want us to talk, then type in questions. If you want us to stop talking, then stop typing in questions. So that's how the monk chat works. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Okay, so I see a few people checking in online already. So hello to John, Rick, Vanessa, Mike, Lydia, Wasabi-chan, Manal, Anonymous, Karuna, Zen Bath, Christina, and Maria. Welcome to all of you, and also to everybody else who's watching. So we have our first question here from John. John says, how should we deal with repressed emotions? How do these get buried in us? Well, two different questions. So first off, how do we deal with repressed emotions? Well, the first thing is to be aware of them. So, and we train the mind through mindfulness of emotion, which is an aspect of mindfulness of mind, mindfulness of mental phenomena, by starting with being aware of whatever is available to us. And so starting with awareness of coarser, more obvious emotional formations. And as you develop a more precise and clear awareness of your more coarse, obvious emotions, then you will gradually start to become aware of deeper emotional currents in the mind. And as you become aware of those deeper emotional currents, then they will start to lose their power over you. So they won't necessarily go away. So the emotions might still be coming and going in your mind. But if you're fully aware of them as they arise and as they're present, then they won't control you. And you can recognize the influence that those emotions are having on you so that you won't be influenced by them, you won't be swayed by them. As for how they get buried in us, millions of lifetimes of delusion, that's how. Basically the same way all of our other subconscious problems arise. We've been rolling around in delusion and defilement since literally beginning this time, literally forever. We've been doing this literally forever. It's really no surprise how messed up our minds are. We've been spending billions of years messing up our minds. So it's kind of like constantly tying a knot and tying a knot and tying a knot and tying a knot and tying a knot for 100 billion years. And then you look at it and you're like, wow, this is a really tangled knot. How did this happen? And it's like, well, you've been working on it for a really long time. So it's not surprising that we have all kinds of complicated, painful, repressed emotions because we've been working on tying our mind into knots for billions of lifetimes. So the situation's gotten pretty bad in there, which is why it's time to get started on practicing with it. Anything you want to add on that topic, repressed emotions?
I could tell perhaps maybe a slightly humorous story about me becoming aware of repressing my own emotions.
Go for it.
If that sounds interesting. It comes to mind, and it's so hopefully someone will find this entertaining, but also illuminative a little bit perhaps as well. I remember I went through a period in life where I became aware of a kind of a funny habit that I had, an odd little habit that I had, where I was I'd be thinking about something that had occurred in the past, either recently or in the distant past. And then I would find myself after 30 seconds or a minute or something like this, humming some obscure tune or some random song, So I might be going about my business, like washing the dishes or something, and I realize why am I humming the theme song to the Brady Bunch, or why am I singing, kind of even just mentally, why am I suddenly singing Happy Birthday? I'm in the middle of Happy Birthday. Why I'm here alone, in the shower or something like this. And so I started to pay attention and go back a little bit. What came before that? Can I remember what came before that? And then I noticed, I was thinking about such and such and this embarrassing moment. Okay. This thing that came up that was embarrassing. And then I started humming this song, or singing this song in my head, or singing maybe a little bit out loud if I was to myself. And it seems like there's a pattern here I noticed over time. What happened before that? Oh, it's another embarrassing moment. And I realized that, okay, so what it occurred to me what was happening was I was covering over this embarrassing moment, this memory of one or other embarrassing moments. I didn't like to be embarrassed. And so I would subconsciously, I guess, my subconscious would kick in and divert me by starting up a song. and, uh, and, uh, and so this mindfulness about what I was thinking and what I was doing was helpful in tracing back and seeing the patterns. And then I started to come to terms with, why am I embarrassed about these things? And what is it like to be embarrassed? And how do I let go of being embarrassed? And how do I deal with being embarrassed? And these kinds of things. And so over time, it helped me to practice letting go and coming to terms with myself and my foibles and all this kind of thing. So,
Yeah, that's a really good practical example. Yeah, thank you. Okay, and Vanessa says, how can we be a strong source of support for loved ones going through tough/traumatic situations, but especially ones we haven't personally been through? For example, fatal illnesses, infidelity, death. Well, it's not necessary for you to have gone through exactly the same situation that somebody else has gone through in order to be of support for them. Often being of support for someone means asking them how they're doing, listening to them attentively and caringly with a lot of loving kindness in your heart, being open to receiving whatever it is they have to say about their experience. And also through actively demonstrating acts of caring for them. So look for things you can do which will make them feel cared for, which will make them a little bit happier, or feel a bit more comfortable, or a bit more at ease. So these are the two things I'd really recommend. So first, listening with full attention and loving kindness, and also look for tangible actions of kindness and generosity that you can do to make them a bit more comfortable. Do you have anything else you'd recommend?
those are great suggestions, Monte. I wonder also if maybe they can make a suggestion of someone else. It sounds like this is about if they want to talk about it and you want to share your own experience in order to help advise them and so on like this. In this particular kind of mode of support, I wonder if perhaps you could connect them with someone else who might be able to help out with that. That's just another idea. Perhaps if, for example, would they like to speak to a clergy of their religion, for example, or a therapist, or if you can remind them of a friend or a relative that they have respect for that may have gone through a similar circumstance. Maybe they could chat with, share their emotions with.
Okay, and Rick says, can you share some reflections on emptiness and how emptiness might guide our meditation and daily life practice? So I've often found that how can I put this in a polite and gentle way? Often people are asking questions about calculus and physics when they really need to be asking questions about arithmetic. So emptiness is a very advanced topic in Buddhism. It's actually touching on one of the most profound aspect of Buddhist philosophy. The vast majority of Buddhists in the world have absolutely no clue what emptiness is. And of the people who think they do know what emptiness is, most of them don't. They just have some kind of delusional idea about it. So most people, what they need to work on is kindness, patience, equanimity, generosity, friendliness, tolerance, uh, self-awareness. And as they do that, then they might start to notice that everything is constantly changing. They might start to notice that nothing has any lasting substance or reality to it, and that our constant expectation for things to have lasting substance or permanence generates suffering. But when we relax into the reality of the constantly changing, insubstantial nature of all things, when we just fully accept that everything is in a state of flow, then the mind relaxes and most of our suffering evaporates. So that actually is a way to approach emptiness. It's actually not quite yet the perception of emptiness, but it's approaching it. So the most direct approach is through the recognition of impermanence. But again, if you haven't already developed a very solid foundation in kindness, patience, tolerance, generosity, compassion, self-awareness, self-control, and so on, then it's utterly futile to even begin talking about emptiness because it's just not accessible. It's just not there. Again, there's a reason why we don't teach calculus in kindergartens. There's a reason why we don't talk about quantum physics in elementary school. It's just not relevant. Even if we did, it wouldn't help anyone. So it's the same. The vast majority of Buddhist practitioners in the world are not really ready to even talk about emptiness, let alone try to perceive it. Most of them are still working on their foundations. And that's great. Keep building up that foundation. The stronger your foundation is, the easier and easier the rest of the path becomes. Okay. Okay. Anonymous says, on the form to stay at your monastery, is having health insurance required? So, Anonymous, if you want to come and stay at the monastery, then fill out the application form and wait for a reply. You'll get your answer at that time. Briefly speaking, like every Buddhist monastery in the entire world, this one has rules and protocols for staying here. And a lot of people don't like rules and protocols and therefore don't stay here. Okay, and Rick says, can you offer some guidance on how to skillfully approach longer times of formal practice in seclusion? What do you think?
Well, okay. Let's see. How to skillfully approach longer times of formal practice in seclusion. Well, one thing that first comes to mind is a topic actually we talked about before with Rick, was the benefits of having a teacher. And I remember Rick saying that, as I recall anyway, that it was a little bit challenging for him to find a teacher in his area. But if you can have a consultation with a teacher who can kind of help you assess where you're at now and whether or not taking a step like that, longer times of formal practice and seclusion, is really practical for you and how you might proceed, that would be a good step, talking to an experienced teacher. That's one thing I can recommend. Another perhaps is thinking about why is it that you want to practice for a longer period of time in seclusion. And this can be illuminating, is it, where's it really coming from? Sometimes people want to practice in seclusion because what they really want to do is get away from some problems that they have in their life. I don't know if this would apply to you. There's a story about Ajahn Chah, which is somewhat related. Ajahn Chah was one of the meditation masters of Thailand of the 20th century, and he had been living in monasteries with a number of other monks for quite a while. He was still a junior monk, but he'd been living in monasteries with a number of other monks, and he finally had an opportunity to go live in a monastery that was abandoned. and a small monastery that was abandoned, and it, all on his own. And he was very happy about this because he wanted to finally get away from everyone and be alone. And so he was living there, and he was also trying to take care of the place, even though it was small. And he started thinking, boy, it sure would be nice to have some other monastics around to help me with taking care of the monastery. This is really difficult. and and so he realized that actually there could be problems, in being with other people, and there also could be problems with being alone. And so if you come to see, as he did in this particular circumstance, that his more basic problem was kind of this aversion that you may want to assess. Well, is really being alone in seclusion my best my best next option, the thing I should be going for next, or is it perhaps better for me to seek ways of working with aversion to being with other people, if that's as his case was. And so if you analyze your own situation and see what are the reasons you want to be in seclusion, and especially if you have access to a teacher also, you can talk these kinds of things over with, that can be very helpful as well.
Mm. Okay. And Mike says, how does one deal skillfully with feelings of righteous indignation? I know it's an oxymoron, but I keep getting angry on other beings' behalf, and somewhere instinctually it feels justified. For example, most recently, my parents found a rabbit who frequented my garden with only its head missing. Beyond feeling sad, I felt angry at a being who could commit such cruelty. Well, Mike, first off, just taking that story, finding the rabbit, it sounds to me like you've already made up a story in your mind above and beyond the actual experience. So a substantial amount of my monastic life is spent walking around, walking in nature, walking from town to town, and so on. And it's extremely common to find dead animals. Basically, once you get outside of towns, once you get out into nature, there's death everywhere. You'll just be walking along the road and bam, there's a headless cat. Or you'll be walking through the forest and you'll find a pile of bones. And it's just like, turns out that's a fact of life. It's something that we try to cover up and conceal when we're living in civilization, so-called civilization. But it's a simple fact of life. So sometimes these things happen from accidents. Sometimes it's other animals. Actually, most commonly it's other animals. And animals are not necessarily acting from cruelty. They're normally acting from other things. Occasionally it's humans who sometimes are in fact acting from cruelty. But all of that is just nature. So nature is not particularly kind. Nature, in fact, is extremely cold-blooded and cold-hearted. Nature is more like a big machine that grinds away. And part of that grinding away is a constant process of birth and death. That's of growth and decay. So animals are not exempt from that. They're part of that cycle of birth and death, of growth and decay. And our own human bodies are also not exempt from that cycle. We're also part of that cycle. So a big part of Buddhist practice is coming to complete acceptance with the reality of the cycles of nature. And birth and death, growth and decay, these are just part of the cycles of nature. And accepting the reality of that is a huge burden off the mind. As for righteous indignation in particular, well, righteous indignation usually has two distinct components. So one is the righteous component, which is your moral compass operating, your conscience, your ability to distinguish right and wrong. So that's recognizing that something wrong has happened, something evil has happened. So that ability to recognize good and evil is really, really important on the path of Buddhism. So that part you want to value and cherish and appreciate. The other part is the anger. Anger, on the other hand, is harmful, unwholesome, destructive, painful, and entirely unnecessary. You can recognize that something is evil and improper. You can call it out as evil and improper. You can even actively work against evil and improper things, all without ever getting angry. So recognize what's going on in your mind. Recognize that there's the wholesome component, which is your moral compass, identifying good and evil. Keep that, preserve that. That's great. Applaud yourself for having that wholesome component of mind. Then there's the other part, which is the anger component. That's not good. In fact, that's very harmful and destructive. And that you want to remove, because that anger part is in fact in the category of evil. The very thing that your moral compass is identifying as good and evil, it also identifies that anger as evil, in the category of evil. So use that good moral compass that's in the first half of righteous indignation to recognize the problem with the second half and work on clearing that away from the mind. And I recommend doing a lot of loving kindness meditation and also cultivating this attitude of acceptance of the nature of reality. Reality is a mess, and it's full of awful things, and that's okay, because that's just the way it is. And when you come to that acceptance, then life gets a lot less painful. Okay. And Mariah says, how can I deal with overwhelming restlessness that makes meditating difficult? Even when I sit to practice, my mind races and jumps around for the entire 20 minutes sometimes. I've been very busy at work with the start of the new school year and can't stop planning and thinking about work even when I'm home. I've also worked for the past 20 days with only one day off. Do you have any thoughts on this one?
Well, sure. Let's see. Restlessness to some degree or other is a challenge for all meditators at some time or other. And of course, it sounds like your environmental conditions there, you might say, your work is part of it for you now. But there are definitely things that you can do about it, and meditation will help. Meditation itself will help if you can carve out enough time for it. And so it's great, and I anumodana that you're trying as it is, and you are making time for it already. And anumodana means that I rejoice in this good thing that you're doing. So there's some tactics you can use when meditating to help the mind become calmer. And there are also some tactics you can use throughout the day, even when you're not, for example, sitting in formal meditation or practicing walking meditation. So, for example, when you're practicing formal meditation, you can use a simple mantra like, may I be calm. This could be called a recollection of peace, which is a formal meditation object in Buddhism. And so if you perhaps even harmonize it with your breathing, if you can bring your attention to your breath and thinking, may I be calm. So perhaps as the breath comes in, say, may I, and then as the breath goes out, say, calm, may I be calm. And you say this internally, as you're breathing, and imagine yourself becoming calmer, and focus on this in a relaxed and gentle way. And think of your meditation as a way of becoming more relaxed. There are many different objectives people have when they meditate, and they have different kinds of goals. But if you think of it as particularly a way to relax, at least in the beginning, as you're working with this restlessness, that can be helpful as well. And so you can use this mantra, may I be calm, trying to harmonize it with the breath, perhaps. And you can also look at your meditation posture. This is something I did for a while myself when I was dealing with a lot of restlessness. And I practice lying meditation sometimes. So I lie down on the floor, usually just lying down on my back, with a pillow, and just resolve to stay lying down in that position for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever it might be, and do a meditation like this with the breath and a mantra like this, and or even just lying down like that, being aware of the thoughts coming through the mind, and just trying to not get involved with them, but be aware of them, just like we might be aware of the breath, for example, coming in and out. Just be aware of the thoughts and not getting involved with them and letting them pass through the mind kind of like clouds passing through the sky. We might just see them passing, but not really identify with them and not get involved with them. This also can be very relaxing. It can be helpful to set an alarm for this, so you know when the meditation period is done, but also in case you relax enough that you fall asleep, so that you get up again. Some ways of dealing with restlessness and also dealing with the stress and the busyness at work might be to practice what one teacher calls M&Ms. It's a relatively common practice in meditation circles, which is taking just a little bit of time out throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps 1 minute at a time, maybe 3 times, 6 times, 9 times throughout the day.
Mm.
Some teachers recommend doing it every single hour. Just taking 1 minute out to be kind of by yourself and do some kind of a meditation that's helpful, like counting your breaths, for example, or using a mantra like this, "May I be calm." And so this teacher called it M&Ms because it was mindfulness minutes, or meditation minutes. I can't remember which, actually, mindfulness minutes or meditation minutes, however you think about it. And so it's sweet like candy, M&Ms, and so you can remember that easily. And so this kind of puts brakes and pauses in the stress levels and in the busyness. And then you may find that when you go into your formal meditation practice, that it's easier to be calm. So those are a few ideas I can recommend.
Great, good. Okay. And Brian says, was there a moment or experience that left you both with a sense of certainty that monastic life was your path? Well, certainty is an interesting word here. So I think even when I first went to stay in a monastery with the intention to stay indefinitely, like indefinitely meaning years, which in fact I did. I went and haven't stopped. But even then there was the attitude of, I'm going to try this out and see how it goes. So when I started practicing Buddhism, in the beginning I just thought I was just going to be a lay person who did some Buddhist practice. After a year I started thinking, well, maybe I should consider the possibility of monastic life, but still I wasn't anywhere close to certainty. After 2 years I was like, no, I want to try out being a monk and see how it goes. And after 3 years I went to a monastery with the intention to give it a really sincere try. And the result was that through the course of monastic life I noticed radical improvement in my practice all around, like off the charts. It was like going from crawling to running. Like the difference was just immeasurable. And so, yeah, I would say after a year or so of monastic life, then I was certain that was what I wanted to do indefinitely. Yeah. But it's hard for me to pin down a single moment. It was more just like a gradual accumulation in the mind. So with every day of Buddhist practice, there started to accumulate this deeper and deeper faith in the power of the Buddha's teachings. And a central part of the Buddhist teachings is monasticism. So it's not for everyone, but the Buddha was very clear that monasticism is for those who want to make the swiftest, surest progress. So as my experience with Buddhism grew and my faith in the power of the Buddhist teachings grew, then naturally also my faith in monasticism grew. And especially with actually doing monastic practice for a period of time, it reached a point where it just became absolutely clear that this was the way forward for me, and I wasn't interested in using a slower, less surefire way. How about you? Was there a moment or experience that left you with certainty?
I guess there was. It's funny when you mentioned it's an interesting word, certainty, and thinking about it from the point of view of how uncertain my monastic life has been. Uh, even though I was actually quite certain very early on after encountering the Buddhist teachings that I wanted to be a monastic. This is also kind of surprising. It's actually quite surprising um, because it can be such an uncertain thing. But I very quickly decided that I wanted to be a monastic. I ended up ordaining as a bhikkhu about a year or a year and a half later, something like this, of very quickly after I was first exposed to Buddhism. And I'd been in the monastery for 2 months, the monastery I ordained in. And it was the first Buddhist monastery I'd ever been in, as I recall, actually. And I ordained after just 2 months in the monastery, and I was telling my teacher there, I'm going to be a monk for the rest of my life when I ordained. He says, well, it's good to be determined, but, life is uncertain, and you don't really know how things are working. I said, no, 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 really, I'm going to be a monk for the rest of my life. And I was very emphatic. and so, I did ordain, and I ended up being a monk for 2 years, exactly, and almost exactly, and returned to lay life, much to my surprise. and had a wonderful experience that was very important and very valuable. But I ended up returning to lay life because I'd realized that I'd ordained too quickly and I wanted to set up a more tenable situation. And much to my surprise, a full 13 years went by in lay life before I went into a monastery again to be on the ordination path. and and I went into the monastery, and I was so relieved to be back in the monastery and to be getting back into monastic life. And I was so happy. And I entered the monastery here in the United States, and thinking, I don't want to go back to Asia. The first time I ordained, I went to Asia for about 9 months of it, and I got very sick there. And I said to myself, I don't want to go back to Asia. I want to be a monastic in the West, and I'll go to a monastery here in America. Well, about a year and a half later, there I was on a plane to Thailand. Because, as it turned out, I couldn't ordain at the monastery. I had health problems still from my first tenure of monasticism. So I found myself, much to my surprise, on a plane to Thailand, where I did end up ordaining in 2014. Ended up living in Thailand for 10 years in total. And it's a little bit of time before I ordained as well. And much to my amazement, after so long in Thailand, how did I end up being in Asia for so long? I never saw this happening in my course of life, And so I've only returned to the States back in February of 2023. So life is very uncertain, and monastic life also. And the second time around, when I ordained, people ask me, would you want to be a monk for the rest of your life or something like this, I always said, well, it's uncertain, we'll see how things go, but internally I was saying, I'm definitely going to be a monk for the rest of my life. But I always say that because I knew actually life is very uncertain. Intellectually, I knew this. And that's the counsel of other monastics I've heard from as well, that actually you don't really know what's going to happen. And many monastics who ordain intending just to be monks for a short time end up being monks for the rest of their lives, for decades. And so, but by and large, people who have a great deal of faith in Buddhism find it to be a very productive experience, however long they're in robes.
Mm.
And so I can highly recommend giving it a try. If you go into a monastery and stay there as a layperson, for example, on the 8 precepts for a little while, as we have some lay residents doing here now at Empty Cloud, and see what it's like to be in monastic life, and then try perhaps going into robes for a little while, and see what the experience is like, and knowing that nothing is permanent, and we'll just see what kind of benefits we get from it, and then we may move on to something else, or we may stay in monastic life. But one meditation master in Thailand, I know, he said that if you're a monk for 2 days, you'll make as much good karma as you would in a full year in lay life. And see,
It seems like fuzzy math.
Sounds like fuzzy math.
I'm not so sure about the math on this one.
Okay. So, well,
I do it more in dog years. Like when 1 year as a monk is like 6 or 7 years as a layperson.
Okay. Well, so
I think
anyways,
2 days in 1 year, that's a bit too big of a gap.
Just too big of a gap. Okay. Well, but in either case, if we take 6 or 7 years per year, or a full year per 2 days, it's the vastly greater benefit to being a monk, monastic life. And, well, I can't vouch for the exact number. It feels to me like I've developed much more in this past decade as a bhikkhu than I did in the corresponding 10 years before I ordained. And that's why I can highly recommend it.
Okay, and here's one. Yongchu says, could you please clarify on the wanting immaterial existence as pointed out as one of the 10 fetters? I wouldn't mind getting reborn in a higher realm where I don't get sick and get old. Yeah, that is in fact desire for immaterial existence. You just pinned it down. So it's wanting to exist as a mind-only deva. So wanting to exist as a disembodied mind. So usually where this comes from is from people who at some point recognize that bodies are pretty inconvenient. Physical bodies are actually quite awkward and not so great. It's more like an anchor holding us down, or the proverbial albatross around the neck. And so what we're supposed to do is then direct the mind towards complete awakening, where the mind is completely happy whether you have a body or not. But some people instead go towards just wanting to get rid of the body and only have a mind. And that is in fact the desire for immaterial existence, to exist as a mind-only being without a physical body. And there's actually huge problems with that state of existence. There is no record anywhere in Buddhism of someone in that state of existence attaining awakening, or getting anywhere close to awakening, or making one step of progress towards awakening. It's basically a complete waste of time. It's not bad, it's just a complete waste of time. So there's no point in wasting your good karma trying to be reborn without a body. Much better to use your good karma to practice for full enlightenment, full awakening, so that then you're happy whether you have a body or not. Okay, and Mark says, wondering if you've heard of a book, Vimutti Dhamma by Piyadasi Bhikkhu from Thailand. First time I've ever heard mention of Kundalini in Buddhism in relation to jhana. I don't know of this book. Have you heard of this book?
No, me neither.
No. I mean, the name Piyadasi is relatively common, not super common, but there's a few famous monks with that name, and probably innumerable non-famous monks with that name. Kundalini is not, in fact, anything to do with Buddhism, so that's a giant red flag right there. So I'm already extremely skeptical of this book, but I don't know, I've never read it, I don't know anything about it. Okay, here's a question for Ajahn Wade. Bhavani says, why are people scared to die?
Wow, right, okay. So, yes, well, I think there's some things that we can see, that we know, if we think about it, that people are afraid of being separated from everything that they hold dear. And so if they think of their family, for example, or their friends, or their roles in life that they picture themselves being in, and thinking of being separated from all of these kinds of things, their material possessions also, these are concerns that are quite natural to have, but the Buddha recommended that we reflect on it frequently, that everything we hold dear will change and will be separated from us. And I've read that it actually can be translated in the inverse, so that I will change and become separated from everything that I hold dear. So, yes.
Yeah.
So that's death being kind of the ultimate case of that in relation to this life, that will change and become separated from everything we hold dear. Another reason that people often are afraid of death is fear of the unknown, what will happen after I die. And so if we have faith in rebirth, for example, and we've done good karma, and we have faith in karma that good actions will bring good consequences, this can buoy us, and help us to deal with this fear of what will come next. It says in the suttas that the opposite is true as well, that if you've done bad karma, and if you've done bad karma, coming to the end of your life, foreseeing that you'll pass away, there's a statement in the suttas that's the Buddha says it's like it's as though the shadow of a huge mountain falls upon you, the sadness and the feeling of concern over what will happen to you when you die. So that's another potential reason why people may be afraid of death. I think perhaps the most serious and the most deeply rooted is the fear of annihilation. That it's common to all living beings until they've attained some stage of awakening that they identify very strongly with the body. And so if something happens to the body, then they feel that it's happening to them. If the body ceases to function, as it dies, then the heart feels that it is itself annihilated along with the body. And so this is why the people have this deep fear, this terror of death. But we can overcome that by attaining the first insight knowledge. This is the discrimination of mind and matter, where the mind becomes unified through concentration. Develop our concentration and our calm to a point where the mind becomes unified. And then in experiencing a sense object, whether it's the meditation object we're practicing with, or something we see or hear, for example, or something we feel, like physical discomfort, if the mind then investigating, with keen, continuous mindfulness, becomes self-aware. It notices that there is the sense object, and there's the knower of the sense object, which is distinct. And that knower of the sense object is the mind itself. In this way, the mind becomes self-aware, discriminates the difference between the mind itself and matter. In this way, it becomes aware that there's more to itself than just the body. And so this is a way of overcoming fear of annihilation at death. And I think one interesting thing about it is that it's the first insight knowledge. So if we can make the mind calm and apply ourselves to investigation, then this is a wonderful fruit of the practice that awaits us even just at the first level of insight knowledge.
Okay, good. And Dempsey asks, is there any special importance given to the water in the suttas or elsewhere that you might have read in terms of drinking, bathing, storage, or spiritual practices with water? No. In fact, there are many suttas where the Buddha directly condemns any kind of ritual practice with water as being utterly useless. So during the time of the Buddha, a very common non-Buddhist practice was ritual bathing, which was based on the belief that if you bathed at regular intervals, one of the more common ones was 3 times a day, and you would bathe with cold water 3 times a day. There was a belief that this would purify your karma, it would wash away your bad karma. And the Buddha was absolutely clear, sorry, that doesn't work at all, completely useless. I mean, it might make you smell nice, but that's not going to do absolutely anything whatsoever for your karma. And in fact, the belief that those practices are spiritually beneficial is a form of delusion which prevents the mind from attaining awakening. So the Buddha was quite openly critical of ritual bathing practices. There was also a belief, which still persists to this day. There was a belief that bathing in certain holy rivers or holy lakes would also have some kind of spiritual purification effect. And there also the Buddha was extremely clear, no, that doesn't work. The only way to purify the mind is through practicing morality, concentration, and insight. Bathing in specific places, or bathing a certain number of times, or bathing with a certain water temperature, none of that was going to have any spiritual benefit. There might be some physical benefits or something, but not any spiritual benefit. Okay. Okay, Vladi says, how do we handle that deep and intense anger and hatred where we perceive injustice? I think I already explained that sufficiently. Pay attention to the inherently painful and harmful aspect of anger and hatred. So no matter how much you try to justify anger and hatred are still evil. And in fact, a lot of the people in the world who do evil things, they have very logical reasons for it. They may be acting from anger and hatred that they think is completely justifiable. Doesn't mean it's good. In fact, quite the opposite. It can motivate people to do incredibly awful, terrible, vile things. One of the interesting things is studying a bit about Hitler and the various social reforms that Hitler was doing in Germany. And you read the intentions and motivations behind it, and it all sounds great. Like, let's make society better for everyone, let's solve economic injustices, let's make prosperity and safety for everyone, and great motivations. End result, millions of people killed in horrific ways. So the justifications were great, but those justifications were used to justify anger and hatred, leading to mass scale torture and genocide. So this is the problem. Whenever we start justifying unwholesome mind states, then we very easily wind ourselves walking down a very dark and evil path. And even worse, we do so thinking it's right to do so. So again, preserve your moral compass. Moral compasses are great, but recognize that anger is on the evil side of the moral compass. Therefore, you don't want that in your mind. It will just make you an awful person. Okay, so Anonymous is asking more questions about the guest application form. Anonymous, I recommend that you send an email to the monastery. If you're looks like you're having trouble filling out the application form, write an email to the monastery. Okay. Vanessa says, I've heard suffering is what makes life beautiful in talks with others. I never quite know what to say, so I usually let the conversation go. Is this an appropriate response? Is there a better one? What do you think?
Well, it's of course you could gauge what is appropriate in each situation. Of course, every conversation is different. Each person you're talking with is different, and so that's certainly all right. Sure, to just if you to just keep silent is perfectly all right. You can't be faulted for that. At least you haven't said anything wrong, and so there's no problem with that. Yeah, so I think some people are quite attached to suffering. I remember there's a story about one of the elders of the Western Sangha in the Ajahn Chah lineage. She was counseling a woman who was crying because her beloved pet dog had passed away. She was talking about it with him, and she was crying, and he was telling her, about how to let go. Try to let go so you can overcome your suffering. And after a few minutes of this, she says, "But I don't want to stop suffering. I want to feel sad. I want to grieve my dog passing away." And this took the teacher by surprise, because he'd been so used to thinking about how do we overcome suffering and counseling people to overcome suffering, and some people are quite attached to their suffering, and can even find or feel that it helps them to grow, to suffer, that helps them to grow. It can get insights about life through suffering, and these kinds of things, and in fact there is some truth to that, and so every person kind of has to find their own way of relating to suffering, and so it isn't like this is this kind of a statement, suffering is what makes life beautiful, is never necessarily really absolutely true or absolutely false. I think it kind of depends on how you relate to it and what the situation is. There are circumstances in life where, for example, the meditation masters will say, well, if you're having a lot of difficulties in your life, you can reflect that even just by being patient and enduring the difficulties and persevering, you're developing yourself spiritually. And one master said, you can even have gratitude for someone who is doing really nasty things to you, someone who's really acting like an enemy towards you. You can have gratitude towards this person, because in withstanding the difficulties, you'll be growing in his good spiritual qualities. And I think this also can be quite true. And so we can think about suffering in different ways, and, and different people relate to it differently. But there are different ways that are skillful of looking at it also in different situations to help us to withstand suffering and to grow still.
Okay, and Lydia says, is immaterial existence the same as being born in a pure land? No. So, first off, when we use the term pure land, it's important to distinguish whether we're talking about pure land as it's described in the Theravada suttas or as it's described in the Mahayana suttas, because there's a lot of overlap between the two concepts, but also some divergences, which can make it a bit complex. So in the Pali Suttas, the pure land, the Suddhavasa, is the planes of existence where people who are on the verge of full awakening, when they pass away, without having attained full awakening, they're born in the Suddhavasa, which is a group of Deva realms where people on the brink of awakening live their final years, actually eons usually, final eons, as they very, very slowly inch towards full awakening. And in the Mahayana system, there developed particular forms of practice with the intention of being reborn in the Pure Lands. The idea being that they're the ideal place to practice Buddhism. But it's explained a bit differently. But the basic idea is similar. There are places where once you go there, you're bound to eventually attain awakening. However, whether or not you have a physical body in the Pure Lands, either in the Theravada description or the Mahayana description of Pure Lands, this is a point of debate as to whether you actually have a physical body or whether you are a mind-only being projecting an experience of a body. And I've seen very good arguments on either side, and I don't personally have a strong opinion on the matter, and I also don't think it's particularly relevant, because if you're being born in a pure land, then you're guaranteed to attain awakening sooner rather than later, so doesn't really matter whether you have a body or not. And if you're not in the Pure Lands, then it doesn't matter whether or not the beings in the Pure Lands have bodies or not, so it's just not relevant, which is probably why there's no clear answer anywhere in the Buddhist text to this question, because it's just really not useful to know the answer. It doesn't help at all. And Jake says, what advice do you have for busy parents interested in Buddhism? Ajahn Wade, what do you think?
Okay. The first idea that pops into my mind is to talk to some busy parents who are interested in Buddhism and find out what advice they have for you. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Perhaps I can offer some good advice, but I've never been a parent myself. And so I can only talk about it from seeing what I've noticed for other parents, and so and for other people who are parents interested in Buddhism. And one thing I can think of is that if you
1 second, Ajahn. Please carry on.
Okay, we just had to say something to someone off camera briefly, so we might muted the microphone. But yeah, so I've never been a parent, but some things from what I've seen over the years, I think there are some tips I might have. For example, if you can find a Buddhist institution that has programs for children, this could be very helpful. I don't know where you are, Jake, but for example, the Western a Forest Sangha monastery in England named Amaravati, as I recall, has like a Sunday school program for children. And so the children can be involved in a Dharma program while the parents are doing meditation, and listening to Dhamma talks from the teachers in another area. So it's sort of a Sunday school kind of setup there. You also can look at, is it possible for one parent to go with the children to a Buddhist institution that is having some kind of a program that's kind of appropriate and suitable for children, while the other one can go to a program that they find more suitable for them. The reason I say this is that, for example, sometimes the parents may want to go listen to a Dhamma talk, for example, but the children may find it impossibly difficult to sit still and to listen quietly to a Dhamma talk and sit through meditation. This can be very distracting for the parents, and so if the children could be engaged in something, and perhaps one of the parents could go with them to a service that has something that's more appropriate for children. Although I remember when I was a child and my parents took myself and my brothers to church, we had exactly the same kind of problem. We found it incredibly difficult to sit still and be quiet through the church sermons. And so they would give us sometimes little puzzles to do and things like this on paper while we were sitting there in the pews. And I did pick up some very useful things and heard some memorable teachings, even so, as I was sitting there. So it still was a valuable experience. I think also trying to integrate your children into your practice is very helpful. For them, for you, for the family. They used to say that a family that prays together stays together, and I think this must be true also for families that practice Buddhism together. And so if you can find a way to introduce the children to it that's palatable for them, this could be a great growth experience for the whole family. Chanting, I think, for example, like loving kindness chants can be very accessible for children. Also, the Jataka tales. There's some Jataka tales that are quite engaging, And even if we approach them as teaching stories, so whether we know if they're true or not, if we can draw from them the morals and consider them to be teaching stories, like teaching stories of any tradition, these can be very engaging for the children and teach good moral lessons, that you can all discuss. So these are some ideas I can offer.
Okay. And Jay Morgan says, do you need to study the suttas to become enlightened, or is listening to Dhamma talks daily enough? Well, read the suttas. So the suttas are the closest you can get to the actual words of a fully enlightened Buddha. So listening to Dhamma talks daily is not bad. It's still probably mostly good. But those are just the opinions of people. So of course I like my opinions. I think they're great opinions. And of course I think they're right, which is why they're my opinions. But nonetheless, they're my opinions. So if you listen to my talks, you're just getting my opinions. If you listen to Ajahn Wade's talks, you're just getting Ajahn Wade's opinions. You listen to any random monk's talks, you're just getting that random monk's opinions. Those opinions may or may not be in line with the Buddha's teachings. Again, I'm pretty confident that everything I say is in line with the Buddha's teachings, but maybe I'm wrong. Please tell me if I'm wrong. Reading the suttas is your way of knowing, as close as it's possible to know, what the Buddha said. I'm not saying that the suttas are 100% accurate as precise verbatim quotes of the Buddha. I wish that was true, but I actually don't believe it's true. But they're as close as we can get. So yes, you do need to read the suttas and study the suttas, and ask questions about the suttas and discuss the suttas. And also listen to Dhamma talks. Okay. Okay, and Mike says, are there any suttas or practices you might recommend to gain a better grasp on the reality of life and death? I've read about corpse contemplation, but worry that I may be too early in my practice. What do you think?
Sure, okay. Are there any suttas or practices you might recommend to gain a better grasp of the reality of life and death? Yes, okay. Well, yes, corpse contemplation, of course, is a teaching in the suttas, and it's upheld by meditation traditions in Theravada Buddhism and other schools of Buddhism as well. But it can be difficult for people to practice, and whether or not it's suitable to practice depends on where you're at in your meditation and your your own personality and so on as well. So it's wise to look into it with some discernment and other practices as well. The some I think that it's very good to have a teacher. This is one of the conditions stated in the suttas for making progress on the path. It says in the suttas that the two most important qualities for a beginner on the path, or I should say the two most important factors in life, you might say, are your own appropriate attention, that is having some discernment about what's appropriate to pay attention to and how to interact with it mentally and emotionally. And the external factor is is a wise friend, a guide on the path. And so having a teacher to help you with these kinds of decisions and being able to evaluate and assess where you're at is really indispensable. Having said that, you might focus on some of the basic fundamentals, wanting to have a full spiritual practice, such as practicing generosity, keeping the 5 precepts, and some basic fundamental meditation practices. Breath meditation, for example, is a meditation practice that's considered by Theravada Buddhism to be a practice that's suitable for all personality types. And there's a wealth of information about the basic practices of breath meditation available from many sources that you can consult. Loving kindness meditation also can be such a wonderful meditation method. There's also quite a bit of information available about that as well. There also are the 5 subjects for frequent recollection, which are recollections the Buddha gave us for all people to perform frequently. And they're the recollections that we are subject to aging, and we're subject to disease, and subject to death. We're subject to being separated from all that we hold dear. And the 5th one being that we are the owners of our actions and live dependent on our actions. And so, from time to time, having made the mind calm, practicing some meditation, we can contemplate these and see what kinds of emotions they bring up, what kinds of ideas they bring up, and sit with them and meditate with them a little bit more, and then maybe return to breath meditation or loving kindness meditation. And I think you'll find that practicing in these ways, this kind of a full, kind of basic, foundational method of practice, that you'll make some very good progress, but you'll also develop more questions, and you certainly want to find a teacher that you can consult at some point as well.
And Moriah says, do you think it's possible to correct misbehavior in young children without administering consequences? Whenever I do this, it makes me feel guilty. I feel averse to administer consequences. Well, one thing that I've noticed is that in recent years, there's a much higher rate of misbehavior among children. And in recent years, there's been a trend towards being very gentle and accommodating with training children. Honestly, I think that these are directly correlated. I'm not an expert on parenting. In fact, I have actively avoided parenting my entire life, and I plan to continue doing so. So I'm not an expert on parenting, but I have noticed a correlation between gentle parenting and misbehaving children. So I was raised with relatively strict parents, and it turned out quite well. I observe other people raising their children in extremely lax, permissive ways because apparently it's supposed to be psychologically good for the children or something, and the results I see are really bad. And this is not my own opinion exclusively. I've heard many other people, my age and older, who have commented on the same thing. So I personally suspect that if you want, out of compassion for the child, if you want that child to grow and develop into a good, decent human being, then you need to learn how to discipline them. and recognize that administering consequences is an act of compassion. So it's kind of like when you have a problem with, say, the dog jumping on the sofa or the cat jumping on the table. Well, one of the old school ways of dealing with this is with a squirt bottle. The cat jumps on the table, you squirt it with the squirt bottle. And eventually, the cat starts to understand there are consequences to jumping on the table. So is it particularly nice? Not really. But it's a way of teaching it that certain behaviors are off limits. So if your child is punching other people at school, administer some bloody consequences. That child needs to learn to stop punching people. And sometimes you need to use strict, harsh methods in order to break bad behaviors. So again, I'm not an expert on child psychology, but I really do think that these days people are way too lax and permissive, and that's just leading to people being very badly behaved. Also, kids should not have smartphones, they should not have tablets, they should not be watching TV, they should not be watching movies. Ideally, they also shouldn't be listening to pop music. I would actually ideally recommend keeping them away from the internet until they're at least 16. 18 would be ideal. Basically, zero access to toxic cultural influences for as long as possible during their childhood. I would also recommend that. So, strict, consequence-full, harsh discipline, and zero access to toxic cultural influences. That's what I would recommend. Okay. Any thoughts on disciplining children?
No, I think that's I think those are good ideas. You know, yeah, as long as you recognize that the administering of consequences is coming from a place of compassion, you know, that you really want them to improve, that maybe help you feel better about it over time. So.
Okay, and that's the last question. So, and we're getting close to 9 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and conclude it this time. Thank you all for joining in, for your wonderful questions and comments, and we'll conclude it this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.